I'll ask you about like your interview section of Cosmoetica. Your first and foremost, your website is so vast. Like I mean, I sometimes get overwhelmed. Because there are like I've made them in 5 or 6 categories, but there's so much to
Yeah.
to read. Yeah, but anyway, so I'll stick to the interview section, your interview section. So one question I took from you is not asking a lengthy question, and rather space it out into different questions. Like you said that by the 5th interview, you had figured this out, that you wouldn't ask the interviewee like a big question or something where he will go on a tangent or something.
Yeah. Well, and I got that actually from the written interviews more so than I think the video interviews. The video interviews, there was 5 years ago when I started the technical stuff, like we're recording this on Skype. Even just 6 months ago, I don't think Skype had a record feature. So things change and whatnot. So now, knock on wood, if things work out, you'll be able to see you and I side by side, like in that last interview with that fellow.
Yeah.
But I know when I was doing the written interviews, I sometimes would ask questions and I would say, well, I wrote this kind of thing here and I wrote that. And people took that as being huffy or haughty or being, patting myself on the back. And while it was, I can understand why they thought that way, because most people are not going to have read me. Most people are not going to have listened to my ideas or whatnot. You have to, in an interview, recognize that it's the Dan Schneider interview or the Dan Schneider video interview, but that particular episode is about that person and that idea. And interviews have 2 functions. One, if I'm in, just to use, let's say if Albert Einstein were alive, I'm going to interview Albert Einstein about his ideas on math and physics, but I also want to get to who Albert Einstein is. So you want to get to the thing that makes them notable, but also why they are. When I interview actors, for example, I often will ask personal questions. And then later on in the interview, I'll say, well, when you're doing a scene on this kind of in this film and you want to evoke something, or if you're on stage and the actor that you're working with is just phoning it in and not really giving it, how do you react to that? Do you do little things that maybe spur them to more? You have to be able to switch on a dime and be able to if someone brings something up, say, oh, that's an interesting point. Okay, I'm going to follow up on that. It's fun and it's interactive. I think most people don't do interviewing well because they usually have, if you've seen, you've got someone with a clipboard here and they're like, okay, question 1, now they're on question 17, but they don't follow up. Now, if I had a list of, say, 30 questions, in a really good interview, I might only go for the top 16 or 17 questions, and the rest of the interview will be follow-ups or tangents that I go off on. If you're interviewing me and I talk about something that happened when I was 8 years old, and you say, well, that reminds me of a story that Dan wrote, or I think I read it in an essay. Let me ask and make a connection between the two. That's more interesting than just going on asking a real question, because, I mean, you can only, I've talked about, there's a dozen or so major things that I keep hammering home when I talk, especially to young people who want to Skype with me or something. But you have to be able to go into the filigrees of life, these little things that go on. I can talk about how unfair it is that my wife, Jessica, and that I'm stuck working a job and whatnot. I keep telling, Emily Dickinson was a nut job. Yes, she was well off for her time, but she was stuck in her home. Walt Whitman, died, I don't think he died with any wealth or whatnot. This is the way that society has always treated people who have a bit more. I think it's partly out of envy for those few that recognize it, but for the masses of people, they don't. I could walk here in America, and if I said Stanley Kubrick, literally, he's only been dead 20 years. Literally, anyone under 40, there'd probably be 1 or 2% of people that under 40 who know who Stanley Kubrick is, even though he's often considered the greatest American filmmaker, if not the greatest filmmaker.
Yeah, I know. I mean, again, I'm pushing my agenda, but I always feel that the reason all this technical achievements, so much YouTube content is going to only make matters worse. Like maybe with the future generations, they won't even know. One reason they don't know is because they have so much content to, so many video games, so many this, that. But anyway, that's an off topic. So yeah, one more thing I wanted to ask you. So you said that, yeah, but it's amazing how, what I love about your interviews. First, I came to know you is through the interviews. Is you are so analytical and you put so much effort, but at the same time you have to understand that the other person, the interview, will not be in the same mindset, right? They'll be like they have thousands of things on their minds. They're just not that deep. Even some of your own interviews, you have said like, this guy was just miserable, he was just bad, right? But don't you think that's like, I mean, if you're putting so much effort and so much, of your energy, uh, I don't know, it should be guaranteed or something. It's like, you're bound to be.
Well, there's no such thing as guarantees. It would be, it's one of those things. There are people that, the woman, for example, that I interviewed, the name slips my mind. It's 100-something interviews ago. She was an interesting woman to interview. I was interviewing her about something about, I think she had written a book, and she then started, and it was something, it was a topic having to do with maybe paranormal stuff or whatever. Then she went on talking about how she goes on out-of-body voyages past Pluto. And so I think I asked her something like, well, because at that time we had just gotten the first images of Pluto, the planet, or the dwarf planet now, Pluto, from the Voyager or whatever spaceship went by. And I said, well, if you really could fly by there, why didn't you say, well, here's what Pluto looks like, and if you look in the northern hemisphere, you'll see this giant thing. If you have that ability, if you did that and that was confirmed, you're set for life. You could go to you could have a show in Las Vegas, but obviously she wasn't flying through space seeing Pluto and whatnot. But every so often you get these kinds of things. And I'll give you another example. There was a woman that I spoke to, and the subject was "quote unquote" transgenderism. Now I'm not a believer in gender. I think there's the male sex, the female sex, and then there's a few poor people who have born with both sexes, and they eventually have to choose whether they're going to be male or female. But here we have now people saying there's 127 genders or whatnot, which is absolute nonsense. And I was speaking with this woman who was pro-gender. She apparently knew this fellow Bruce Jenner, now called Caitlyn Jenner, who's probably the most famous transgender person in the world now. And I could tell. I asked a few questions about it, trying to be in opposition to it, and she wasn't having any of it. So what did I do? If you watch that interview, I switched my tactics, and I basically asked questions that had absurd premises that she would pick up on. And I think basically it's the old saying of giving a person enough ropes they tie their own noose and hang themselves. Someone watching in 50 or 60 years, when I think science will have caught up to what's wrong in someone's brain, a man who thinks they're a woman or vice versa, will probably have some chemicals or some biological, biochemical therapy that will help these people without cutting off their genitals. That if I'm born a man and think I'm a woman, I just have to take this, or maybe they can shoot little nanoprobes in that will help balance the brain's chemistry, or whatever it might take. But I just let this woman speak, and we'll see. 50 years from now, her views on transgenderism may seem as silly as Abe Lincoln's on race. But I wasn't confrontational. I just let her basically go on, because she was going to have none of, she was not going to listen to my objections. So let us have her say, and we'll see what time says that. So that's a good interviewer, knowing when you have a person who doesn't really want a dialogue. They just want to get up and make a speech. So let her make a speech, and let her go down in flames if she's going to go down in flames.